In addition to the lesson sheet, there are some handouts back there if you missed these last week. We just finished kind of our series on archaeology in the Bible, and I had many people say, well, I missed this week or that week, and I'd like to know what those videos were. So what I promised, and so what I've done is make up a list of all the archaeology Bible videos that we watched. They're all from YouTube, and so if you would like to get that list, it is also on the stand back there as you leave this evening. You can pick that up. Really amazing set of videos. So we kind of call this whole series, the science in the Bible. So the first part was archaeological science in the Bible. What we're going to start tonight is medical science in the Bible, and then we'll go to some physical science in the Bible. So probably not as many lessons as we had on archaeology. I just kind of I couldn't believe, we had done this series kind of partially about 6 years ago, and there really wasn't much out there 6 years ago in archaeology. I think we did 3 or 4 nights of archaeology. I was amazed at how much has surfaced in the last 6 years on the archaeological findings that confirm everything the Bible says. And that's why I couldn't quit. I think we did that for 9 months. Anyway, so there's a lot of videos. It's all the way front page and back page of a piece of paper, all the videos we watched. Anyway, medical science in the Bible. Just kind of tell you a personal story about how I got interested in this. When I was 10 years old, I have a sister 2 years older, a brother 2 years younger. He's now passed. Our mother had very, very severe asthma, very severe. And the last few months of her life, she was pretty much in bed. And about 2 months before she passed, after supper, my dad would make supper, and each kid would kind of go in and visit with Mom for a little bit. And my mom said to me, and it kind of set the tone for my life. She said, "When you grow up, I want you to be a doctor so you can help people like me," because she knew she was not going to be around much longer. Sure enough, she passed a few weeks later. So my path was set. Anyway, so she passed, and my dad raised us for about 4 years by himself. And then he married a wonderful lady named V, who'd never been married, never had any kids. She was so brave to marry a man with 3 kids. And, she was a great stepmom. But something she did, when this book came out, the first book ever that came out about medical science in the Bible, she knew what my aspirations were, so she got me a copy of that. And some of the things that we're studying tonight are still from that book because they still hold true today. So we did this series about 6 years ago and did a little bit of this, kind of some bits and pieces of it when COVID first hit, and this church kind of had to scramble and figure out how to do online videos. And so Pastor Mike had me do a couple of these for Wednesday night services. Anyway, so you might have seen that, but to me it's fascinating. It's fascinating, and as you go through this, I think you'll be amazed also, because I promise you, you've probably never heard most of this unless you've been in this class before. So we're going to kind of start through this, and tonight we're looking at the Bible and medical science and contagious diseases. So, what's difficult about contagious diseases? As humans, we like to know what we're up against. And so seeing our enemy is actually comfortable because we kind of know what we're up against. And that's why contagious diseases can be so scary. And so surely you remember 2 or 3 years ago just how the world was just in tremendous anxiety and fear over COVID. I mean, we didn't know who had it, how bad it was, who was going to die, who was going to live. It was scary. And right now we kind of have the flu, and we have another virus called respiratory syncytial virus, RSV. Then we've got some COVID, but thankfully the COVID strains now are not nearly as aggressive and harmful as the one we had 2 years ago. But because of COVID, we're all kind of very familiar with social isolation and quarantine and distancing and hand washing and masking and all that stuff. So that's all very fresh on our minds. So what we're trying to do with this lesson is kind of look, first of all, at the medical science history of how all this stuff came about, and then look back at ancient history of kind of what science believed years ago, and then compare that to what God told the Israelites back 3,500 years ago, and how the Bible was ahead of everybody else. Because God knows all this stuff. He knew all this stuff, and so he kind of told his people how to stay healthy long before science ever figured out why he told them how to stay healthy. So basically, there's just when you look at medical modern science, it's kind of like the science is kind of like here's the knowledge of the universe in all areas of science. But tonight we're talking about medical science. It's like man kind of just gradually over hundreds of years peels off the layers that allows him to get closer and closer to the truth that God knew all along, because he's the one that created everything. Anyway, so if you look at the belief about contagious disease, that's kind of what we're going to start tonight. The Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, some people call it one, some people call it the other, but basically that's considered to be from the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, which is the late 400s, 400 years, almost 500 years after Jesus, and up to the 1700s, maybe kind of a little bit into the 1800s. So we're talking about 1,300 years. It's considered the Dark and the Middle Ages. And so the very best scientists in the world during those times had the belief that contagious disease, or diseases that would spread through a community, was not, they had no idea about germs and viruses and bacteria. They called it miasma. And what that meant was bad air. So the belief for hundreds and hundreds of years by the smartest people in the world was that diseases that caused a lot of people to be sick were because those people that got sick were all breathing the same bad air. So it was called miasma. So it really wasn't a germ, but it was just bad air, and that's all they could come up with. Anyway, so what we call, all of us have been to school. In school we learned about germs, we learned about bacteria, we learned about viruses. So this is kind of common knowledge to us. That's what the current theory of infection is, and we believe it to be true. Of course, the scientists also believe that miasma was true for thousands of years. But what we believe is called the germ theory of disease. And so it really began kind of, again, peeling off the first layers back in the late 1600s when microscopes were invented, because as you know, bacteria and viruses cannot be seen with the naked eye. So a Dutch scientist named Van Leeuwenhoek was the first person under the microscope to identify what we now know is bacteria. Of course, they were very primitive microscopes, so they really couldn't see what we can see today with microscopes, but still he could see these little organisms moving, and he called them animalcules, or tiny animals. He just knew they were something that he could see under there was moving, so it had to be alive. It wasn't something that was dead. Everything else he was looking at was dead. So he called them animalcules, but he had no idea they had anything to do with the disease whatsoever. And then kind of fast forward to the 1700s. In the 1700s, there were several smallpox epidemics throughout history. In the 1700s, Europe had a terrible, terrible smallpox epidemic for years and years and years. And 400,000 people or more died every year of smallpox. Now, to give you an idea, if America has 350 million people and we lost 1 million to COVID, Europe back then had about 60 million people, and they were losing 400,000 a year. So basically the death rate then to smallpox was six times higher than what we had with COVID. And so you know how afraid everybody was with COVID. If the death rate was 6 times higher, we'd be 6 times more afraid. I mean, basically you never knew at the end of the year if we'd be alive or dead. And so there was another disease that was very similar to smallpox. It was called cowpox. So it was very similar, but it was much less terrible as far as making you really sick or killing you. And so there was a British scientist named Edward Jenner, Dr. Edward Jenner, and the legend is, now we don't know whether this is true or not, but he was an orphan boy at age 12, and there was a milkmaid in the home where he stayed who was a little bit older than him, and you know how when you're 12, 16-year-old girls really look pretty. And he asked her why her face was so pretty. She said, well, I had the cowpox, and so I'll never get the smallpox. It's like she had figured out that she had immunity to smallpox. So many people were getting smallpox. About 1 out of 3 people that got smallpox died. The others that didn't had scars all over them. Anyway, so that's the legend, that as he grew older and became a scientist and physician, that he thought about that, and so he practiced on people that were willing, and basically took somebody with cowpox would take the pus from some of the little pustules or sores on their skin and inoculate it into other people, and sure enough, they didn't get smallpox. And so he found, he didn't know why this worked, had no clue why this worked, but it turns out the viruses that cause smallpox and cowpox are so similar that if you have one and then your body gets antibodies to that, it will make you immune to the worst disease. So that's why that worked. So that was the first vaccination, but again, he had no idea why that worked. Fast forward to the 1860s, everybody's heard of Louis Pasteur because you buy pasteurized milk, right? And so there were a lot of people contributing to this, but he was kind of the main guy. That he made one of the first great breakthroughs in causes and prevention of disease. And so this is kind of when the germ theory of disease kind of really started solidifying. And he's the one that figured out that if you took milk and heated it up just a little bit and cooled it down, that it would last a lot longer and wouldn't spoil so quickly. And so we call that now pasteurization. So I looked up to see what that was. I always wondered what what do they do with milk? So here's your little trivia information that's about pasteurization. Pasteurization, they heat milk to 161 degrees for 15 seconds, and then they rapidly cool it. And what that does, that kills the most common bacteria, which is E. coli and Salmonella. And that gives you a shelf life of 2 or 3 weeks. And so that's why we can buy milk that's, and it'll stay in your refrigerator for 2 or 3 weeks. Well, you may have seen, and I thought, well, what about this milk now that you can buy that's good for 2 or 3 months? Have y'all seen that? It's called Fairlife is one brand, and Horizon Organic. So I thought, let's read about that as long as we're here. They call that ultra pasteurization. And for that, they heat the milk to 280 degrees for 2 seconds and then rapidly cool it. And that gives you a shelf life of 60 to 90 days because it kills even more bacteria. And then I thought, well, I've seen places where they had milk in cartons on a shelf, not even a refrigerator. How do they do that? Well, that's called ultra high temperature pasteurization. And so I looked at the Walmart website to see if I could buy some of that. Sure enough, you can buy it online. I haven't seen it in the store. But they heat it to 302 degrees for 2 seconds, kills all the bacteria, and that way they can put it in hermetically sealed cartons that are airtight, and put it on a shelf, and it'll be good for a shelf for months and months and months. So that's especially good for third world countries where there's no refrigeration. Anyway, that's your update on pasteurization. So that's Louis Pasteur. And then the next guy that really kind of made the movement go forward about germ theory is Joseph Lister. He's a British guy who in the 1870s, he is a surgeon. And of course, back then, no such thing as antibiotics. They didn't come until the late 1930s. Obviously infection was a major, major problem. In fact, my kids know I like this stuff, so they bought me books about it. So one of the books that one of them bought me was about, medicine in the Civil War. And they talked about how more people died in the Civil War of infection than actually getting shot on the battlefield. Because if you get wounded and it gets infected, you get gangrene. And so this may be more information you want to hear about, but what they would do, they would find a small church in the area where the battlefield was, and they would use the communion table as the operating table. They'd somebody got shot, they knew he was going to die if he didn't cut his arm or leg off, so they would, whiskey him up for anesthesia, and 6 people would hold him down, and one guy saw his leg off or saw his arm off, and they'd say, they'd have the closest window, they'd throw the arms and legs out and have a big pile of arms and legs. I mean, brutal times. You don't see that kind of stuff on the movies. We live in amazing times now. We're wow. Anyway, so Joseph Lister was the first person to really promote sterile instruments for surgery and also sterilizing the patient's skin, and he used a substance called carbolic acid to sterilize the instruments and also put on the patient's skin so they didn't get infection. Carbolic acid today is called phenol. Phenol is the main ingredient in good old camphor-phenique. Remember these little green bottles? I think they started selling it again. Camphor-phenique was patented in 1884 because of the findings of Dr. Joseph Lister, finding that phenol was such a good antiseptic. It's also anesthetic. It kills pain, and also it helps coagulate blood so it stops bleeding. So it's a perfect thing to put on wounds. So we actually still use phenol in the doctor's office today when we're doing toenail surgery, because it stops the bleeding and stops the pain, and it's antiseptic. Anyway, so in 1879, Dr. Lister became so famous that in 1879 a chemist in St. Louis patented a new antiseptic mouthwash, and he called it Listerine, from Joseph Lister. I don't know if you ever tasted that. That's nasty stuff. I think that's what started the deal about if it tastes bad, it must be good medicine, I mean, Listerine is like drinking gasoline or something. Anyway, so in the 1890s, the microscopes got better and better and better. They could see smaller and smaller things, so that's when viruses were first seen. Anyway, so by the late 1800s, the germ theory of disease was pretty much set in stone, and miasma was seen as obviously not true. So the scientists were getting smarter and getting closer to God's truth. And like I said before, we live in a great time, and we have all been educated about this. We know about this, but that doesn't mean that everybody in the world knows about this. When I was a medical missionary in Nigeria, most of those folks had not been to school. So they didn't understand about germs. But at our clinic and hospital, everybody that came, we gave them a tetanus shot. And we'd say, this will keep you from, getting tetanus, lockjaw, for 5 to 10 years. And in their minds, they had no clue how that worked. They had no idea about vaccination, how a shot today would help you 5 years or 10 years. Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? But they believed it because they believed in missionary medicine. They said, what you do works, so we'll just have faith in you and have trust in you. And so they'd take the shots. Or we'd give them antibiotics. They had no idea how that worked. We couldn't get measles vaccines. We couldn't get rabies vaccines, so a lot of people died of measles and rabies. But they just trusted us because they had faith and saw that what we did worked. Okay, now let's go farther back than 200 or 300 years. Let's go to ancient science and see what the smart, most educated scientists from 3,500 years ago believed. In archaeology has found a medical book in Egypt called the Papyrus Ebers. This was written 1500 BC, so about 3,500 years ago. It is the most complete work ever found regarding treatments of disease in that era. And there were treatments for 842 ailments found in those writings. Now, these remedies prescribed for various diseases included things like lizard's blood. These are the cures. Swine's teeth, putrid meat, stinking fat, ass's hooves, animal urine, animal manure, flies, moisture from pig's ears. So this was the modern science of 3,500 years ago. The smart guys, right? The smart guys. Now, at the same time, what's interesting, this is the same time the Israelites were in Egypt. And Moses was coming to the fore. Moses was born of Israelite parents, but remember in Exodus 2, remember the Moses in the basket? And he was taken into Pharaoh's house, and he was raised as a son of Pharaoh's daughter. And Paul tells us in Acts 7, there on your lesson sheet, Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. So here we have Moses at the same time as Papyrus Ebers was the mantra, was the treatment for all these diseases in Egypt. So he was instructed in all this. He was instructed in all this. So he was taught all this modern science, all this medicine, and then later he leads Israel out of Egypt, and when they stop at the waters of Marah, God gives Moses a promise for the Israelites. Here's on your lesson sheet, Exodus 15:26. If you will listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, obeying his commands and keeping all his decrees, then I will not make you suffer any of the diseases I sent on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. That's the word Jehovah Rapha. Jehovah Rapha. I'm the Lord who heals you. Now, before we go any further, I want to bring up one disease that's been around for the history of the world called leprosy. Finally, in 1873, Dr. Hansen in Norway discovered the bacteria that caused that. So leprosy is also called Hansen's disease. But leprosy has killed millions of people all over the world for centuries and centuries and centuries. It's pretty much eradicated in America, but we still have one leper colony in America, and it's in Hawaii. But the World Health Organization, I checked it the other day, and it's still reporting more than 200,000 cases of leprosy every year that have been reported in the world. And we know that leprosy is contagious by what's called droplet transmission. So, have you ever been talking to somebody and they're talking and they kind of spit on you a little bit? Or somebody coughs and sneezes and they kind of get you wet? Or even, breathe on a mirror and it's moisture. So as we breathe, droplets of moisture come with our breath, especially when we're speaking, when we're coughing, we're sneezing, talking loud, but even just breathing will get some out. So we know that leprosy was a droplet transmission disease. So we go to one of the most important books in the history of disease, contagious disease. Is called The History of Public Health. It's written by Dr. George Rosen, and he was a renowned professor at the Columbia University Medical School in New York, one of the top medical schools in America. And this is what he has to say about leprosy and the history of leprosy. Leprosy cast the greatest blight that threw its shadow over the daily life of medieval humanity. Fear of all other diseases taken together can hardly be compared to the terror spread by leprosy. Not even the Black Death in the 14th century or the appearance of syphilis toward the end of the 15th century produced a similar stage of fright. Early in the Middle Ages, during the 6th and 7th centuries, it began to spread more widely in Europe and became a serious social and health problem. It was endemic, in other words, it was spread everywhere, particularly among the poor, and reached a terrifying peak in the 13th and 14th century. So we have to ask ourselves, what eventually started bringing leprosy under control in the later Middle Ages? Now remember, this is still hundreds of years before the germ theory of disease was proven. So again, they're thinking miasma, they're thinking bad air, but how do you stop this thing from spreading, this killing so many thousands of people? So Dr. Rosen in his book continues, leadership was taken by the church, as physicians and scientists had nothing to offer. the church took as its guiding principles the concept of contagion as embodied in the Old Testament. This idea and its practical consequences are defined with great clarity in the book of Leviticus. Once the condition of leprosy had been established, the patient had to be segregated and excluded from the community. So the church created leper colonies. This is in the Middle Ages. Following the precepts down in Leviticus, the church undertook the task of combating leprosy and greatly limited the spread of the disease. Wow, that's interesting, isn't it? So before germs were discovered, the church back in the Middle Ages said, let's just follow what God said in Leviticus, see if it works, and it did. So let's kind of look at some of the things in the book of Leviticus that God told Moses. Leviticus was written about 1442, so within a few years of the Papyrus Ebers. Leviticus 13, there on your lesson sheet. This is talking about leprosy. Those who suffer from a serious skin disease must tear their clothing, leave their hair uncombed. They must cover their mouth and call out, unclean, unclean. As long as the serious disease lasts, they will be ceremonially unclean. They must live in isolation in their place outside the camp. So if you have leprosy back then and you're an Israelite, number one, you had to live away from the village. What's that called? Quarantine. And then when you do have to go into the village to buy food, number one, you dress in such a way that people know you have leprosy. That's why I said tear your clothing and leave your hair uncombed. So obviously something's different about you. So people could social distance from you and stay away from you. And then it says you call out unclean, unclean, but before you do that, you cover your mouth. Why? To prevent droplet transmission. So God knew about that thousands of years before we did. That's called a mask. So that sounds exactly what we've been through a couple years ago, right? You know, I had some patients that we're still wearing masks in the clinic. There's been 4 weeks in the last 3 years we haven't had to. What the state health department does, how this works, if you go to the doctor and they say put a mask on, this is what the deal is. The Oklahoma State Health Department each week collects all the data from all the clinics, urgent cares, ERs, hospitals, on all the COVID tests and flu tests done that week. And if your county is above 15% positive on any of those tests, then you wear a mask for the next week. So every Friday we get an email saying you wear a mask or you don't wear a mask. So we've had 4 weeks where we didn't, all of them since this last October. Anyway, but I've had some people question masks, and that's fine if you question things, but if you really want to, quote, research something, don't just Google. There's a website, and you can copy this down. It's called PubMed, pubmed.gov. Stands for Published Medical Research. So all the legitimate medical research in the world, over 30 million articles, are in this library, and it's on pubmed.gov, and it's open to the public, and there's a search bar, so if you want to see what it says about masks, you can put mask and disease or whatever. But I can tell you there have been, since COVID hit, I can promise you there have been hundreds and hundreds of research projects about masks to see how effective they were. And basically the surgical type masks that you see doctors wearing, and you can get them yourself now, are about 70 to 75% effective if worn properly in decreasing contagious disease. So they are somewhat effective. You know, there's these N95 masks that really restrict your air, that they're about 95. They stop such tiny particles. They also decrease your airflow, but they're about 95% effective in stopping disease. And I've had a patient or two, really questioned me about this, and I said, well, have you read Leviticus lately? And then the second thing I say is, well, if you really don't believe in that, then next time you have brain surgery or heart surgery, tell your surgeon and anesthesiologist and all the nurses in the surgery room that you don't want masks on them. You know, and that kind of makes people think a little bit. Anyway, moving on. Anyway, so God 3,500 years ago, when all the best scientists of the day just talked about animal manure and urine and putrid meat, he knew what was going on. And what's even more amazing is that Moses, who had been taught in all the wisdoms of the Egyptians, trusted God. He knew all this other stuff. But God said, if you do what I say, you won't get sick. I can protect you from all of these diseases if you will do what I say. So Moses didn't tell the Israelites to do anything that he learned in Egypt. He trusted God. That's what he wrote down in Leviticus. He didn't include one thing from Papyrus Ebers in Leviticus. So we need to trust God. Even though, I promise you, they didn't understand why he said some of those things. We know now. Okay, so now let's move on to hand washing. So we just kind of looked at quarantine, social masking, social distancing, and wearing masks. So let's look at the history of hand washing. You know, we all do that. We're all taught to do that growing up. You know, wash your hands before you eat, wash your hands after you go to the bathroom. You know, wash your hands this, wash your hands that. And we've been doing it a whole lot more the last 2 or 3 years. Now we have hand sanitizer everywhere because we understand there's germs on our hands that we can spread to other people. So what's the history of that? Well, it all started out in Austria in the 1840s. Got the fellow's name now, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis. And he is known as the father of hand washing. So what's his story? So the big hospital in Vienna, Austria, was considered one of the great medical centers of the 1840s. So think of Mayo Clinic. You know, this is where all the smart doctors are. Well, he was an OB doctor, so he worked in the maternity ward. And now this is 20 years before Louis Pasteur. So again, they don't know about germs and causing disease. You know, this is still back in the miasma, bad air time. And so in the maternity wards of this famous celebrated hospital, 1 out of every 6 women died who delivered a baby. The obstetricians described the deaths to constipation, fear, poisonous air. That's miasma. This is all out of Dr. Rosen's book that we talked about a minute ago. So what happened? Well, and what they died of was what's known as after childbirth, the uterus getting infected, and then it causing blood poisoning. The medical term used to be called puerperal fever, but basically after delivering the baby, they get real sick, and then over the next 2 or 3 days, they get blood poisoning, and then they die. And of course, there was no antibiotics back then. And so here's what was going on at that hospital that Dr. Semmelweis figured out to change. When a woman died, they were wheeled into the autopsy room, and so the next morning, the first order of business each morning was the attending physicians would take the medical students and they would do autopsies on these women who had died. But that's how they taught gross anatomy. You know, when I was in medical school, you know, people who had donated their bodies to science, you know, had been embalmed, you know, so it didn't have to be the next day. Back then there was no embalming, and so you had to do it quickly before things started deteriorating. So they would do autopsies on those women who died of infection, and then they would leave the autopsy room and go to the wards and examine all the women who had had babies the day before. And then and of course, you know, they weren't washing their hands. They didn't know anything about that. So 1 out of 6 women died because Dr. Semmelweis figured out that there was something to do, because the women who were dying were the ones who were examined by the doctors who had performed the autopsies. Whereas the women who were being delivered by midwives, they weren't dying. So he saw the difference that, okay, the people that are doing autopsies and come to the ward, those are the ones that die. Those patients die that get examined by the doctors who had been to doing the autopsies. So he made a rule in his ward that everybody had to wash their hands after they performed autopsies before they examined women. And in 1847, before this new rule went into effect, 57 women had died on his OB ward. And then he instituted the rule of hand washing, and in the next month, only 1 out of 42 died. The next month, 1 out of 84 died. So he knew he was on to something, that this hand washing had something to do with the women living. Now, you say, why didn't they wear gloves? Medical gloves were not invented till the 1890s. So that wasn't even in the picture. Okay, so you would think that Dr. Semmelweis would be absolutely praised for his great finding, right? Well, guess what? The folks that said, we've always done it the other way, won out. Can you believe that? His superiors were prejudiced for the status quo. Change is hard for people. We've always done it the other way, and so they basically, when his contract was up, they ran him out of town. He went to Budapest, to a hospital in Budapest, got a similar position. The exact same thing happened. Women were dying because they were examined by people who had done autopsies on infected women who died. He changed the rules. Women didn't die. They didn't like it. They ran him out of town. He finally wrote a book in 1861 about what he had figured out about this hand washing. But he actually was so distraught, he actually went mentally ill and died at age 47 in a mental institution in 1865. You know, sometimes the old ways are not the best ways. That's why we need to be open to change. Not that all change is good, but we need to be open to it. Anyway, you say, well, that's great that he figured that out. Well, guess what? He wasn't the first to figure that out. Guess who was? God was. Look at Leviticus on your second page. Leviticus 15. Give the following instructions to the people of Israel. So this is God talking to Moses to tell the Israelites. Any man who has a bodily discharge, we're talking about any kind of draining wound, pus, some kind of infection that causes some kind of drainage or something that could touch somebody else. Any man who has a bodily discharge is ceremonially unclean. It means he couldn't go into the temple. So if you touch that man's bed, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean till the evening. If you sit where the man with the discharge has sat, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If you touch the man with the discharge, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. If the man spits on you, I guess they had a problem with that. If the man spits on you, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you'll remain unclean until evening. If the man touches you first without washing his hands, you must wash your clothes and bathe yourself in water, and you will remain unclean until evening. Amazing, huh? I didn't put it on the lesson sheet, but in Numbers 19, God instructs the Israelites not to touch dead people or dead animals. Again, because many of them died from disease, and that could be contagious. So here's my point of this whole lesson. God has given the Israelites instructions on social distancing, on quarantining, on washing of hands and wearing a mask, 3,500 years before today. And hundreds of years, thousands of years before scientists figured out what was going on, why God said that. So now we know why God said that, So here's some conclusions there on your lesson sheet. Number one, God is omniscient. He is all-knowing. While man is very slowly making discoveries about the mysteries of the universe, facts that God already knows because He is the Creator. Like I said, it's kind of like man is kind of slowly peeling off the layers of God's knowledge and gradually, discovering things that God's known all along. Number two, God cares about you and me. He gives us instructions on how life is best lived, not just physically, but spiritually. Which brings us to number three. Just as the Israelites didn't understand the why of infection prevention guidelines God gave them, we today don't always understand the why of His instructions to us. I thought it was kind of like when you have a child and you tell them, don't do this, and they say, why? Well, you're telling that because you're trying to protect them. And they may not understand that, but, that's what a parent does for a child. That's what God does for us. And I think about, those folks in Nigeria that had no clue about germs. No clue. And we said, take this shot, it'll keep you from getting tetanus 5 years from now. Well, you couldn't understand that. But they trusted us. And so that's how we must trust God. When He tells us things to do, and it doesn't make a lot of sense, guarantee you, He knows what He's talking about. He knows what He's talking about. So we need to, that's called living by faith, not by sight. Number four, just like the Israelites found, life is always better when we follow God's instructions, even if we don't understand. So we need to put our full faith and trust in God, our Creator. So yes, I love science, I believe in science, but let me tell you, in the 40 years I've been doctoring, we know a lot more stuff now than we knew 40 years ago. And 40 years ago, we thought we were pretty smart. But I promise you, 40 years from now, we're going to look pretty stupid. So yeah, science is great, but when somebody says, I believe in science, well, the people that were believing miasma and bad air believed in science too. But God knows all. God knows all. So my hope, my faith, my trust is in the Lord. Now, to close out tonight, I just had one more little archaeology video. This is, if y'all been here 10 years, you may remember one of the most remarkable sermons that Pastor Mike ever preached. I'll never forget it. He called it being a lagniappe Christian. You remember that? You know what a lagniappe is? When you go to the restaurant and they bring you, while you're waiting for your food, and they bring you the chips and salsa, or they bring you the rolls. It's the little extra that's free. Okay, so lagniappe means a little extra that's free. So I had one extra little short video that I didn't get to show, and this is pretty amazing, especially since you've heard about the earthquake in Turkey. And I believe that this area escaped the earthquake. I believe this is far northwest Turkey, where we're going to see about a 4-minute video. This is called Cappadocia, and this is remarkable. Between Christianity became the religion of Rome, under Constantine, who created Constantinople. Anyway, but then gradually Islam started coming in, and Christianity started being very persecuted. And so in this area of Cappadocia, northeast Turkey, there are some remarkable underground cities that Christians lived in to hide from persecution. And that's what you're going to see. My sister and I were visiting at Christmas, and I was kind of bemoaning the American culture and how Christianity was dying in American culture, and she said something that kind of caught me. She said, at least they're not killing us yet. There's lots of countries in the world where they are killing Christians. You have to hide for your faith. And that's exactly what these folks did, and I mean, that's phenomenal to me. Anyway, thank you for your attention tonight, and we'll do a few more of these, and so every other Wednesday as we continue to do. Let's stand and we'll have our closing prayer. Thank you, God, for this opportunity to just be amazed at your knowledge. Be amazed that you made all of us, and you made this universe, you made the largest things, you made the smallest things. You made the things we can't see. And Father, you know how it all works. And you know about disease, you know about germs, and you knew it 3,500 years ago when you told the Israelites how to stay healthy. Father, help us to trust you, even when it doesn't make sense, to trust you that you know what's best for us physically and spiritually. God, we're so thankful to be part of your family, so thankful to have this local fellowship here at Ray of Hope. And Father, we just long for others to join us so that each of us can be your representative, your salt and your light, that more people can enjoy the glory of being your sons and daughters. Thank you, God, for loving us and for saving us. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen.